George Lyon, Liberal Democrat MEP for Scotland. Ministers have, after a long night, agreed a position towards the final negotiations on the common fisheries policy reform. What do you make of this latest stage?
Well, I think it's a substantial step forward, which will hopefully lead to a radical overhaul of the common fisheries policy, which everyone agrees has failed the industry and failed the consumer over the last 20 years. They've backed the idea of ending discards. They have backed the idea of introducing maximum sustainable yields, ensuring there is a sustainable future for our fishermen. And they've also backed regionalisation, which is good news for Scotland. It means Scotland will have more power to implement the overall framework of the common fisheries policy, and that's something we've been campaigning for a long while.
I mean, both the UK Minister and Scotland's own Fisheries Minister seem to have come out of this saying that they'd stuck to their principles and achieved what they wanted to achieve. It didn't all go smoothly, as far as I can understand from the details we've got so far. The environmentalists, for example, talking about discards, saying it's much weaker than what the European Parliament wanted. Are you happy with the stage we're at now?
I think I am. I back the Parliament's strong line on discards, but I also recognise it's a very easy thing to say, just ban discards. But the practical implementation issues within that are not as easy. In a mixed fishery especially, which is predominantly where the Scottish fishing industry works, it's a very, very difficult thing to try and stop discards altogether. So there's issues about what do you do in a mixed fishery. Secondly, there are issues about what do you do with the discards when they're landed, because inevitably they will be landed instead of being thrown overboard. The market doesn't want them, so we need to put in a system that deals with them, and we also need to finance that. So I think it's an easy one to say, well, let's just end them in 2014. But there's a lot of planning that needs to go into this. There's money that needs to be found to finance how it's all going to work. And there is the issue for Scotland in particular of how difficult it's going to be in a mixed fishery to make sure that this can actually work.
As you mentioned at the beginning, a lot of concern about the current common fisheries policy, that it was leading to fish stocks getting very dangerously low. Are you convinced that as things stand now, the fish in the sea will see a better situation in future?
Well, clearly, if we cannot sustain fish stocks, then fishermen's future is they just don't have one. It's as simple as that. So we need to get onto a firm footing where the catch is actually related to making sure that the stock is sustainable in the longer term. The concern I have about implementation again of maximum sustainable yields is that for many fishing stocks we don't actually have the scientific data. So the question is, in terms of implementation, who pays to collect that data? Who's going to do it at a time when member states are all really hard up and there's not a lot of spare cash around? So we need to make sure that before we go to maximum sustainable yield, we're actually able to gather the data and then agree a scientific view of what's allowed to make sure that the fish stocks are sustainable in the longer term. So I back the principle, but clearly there are implementation issues there. But for the future of the industry, maximum sustainable yield is absolutely essential, or else fishermen basically have no future.
And just briefly, a final question on the process. What happens now? It comes back to the European Parliament. We're not yet quite at an end with this one.
No, this is a major step forward, but we now have the final negotiation between the Council of Ministers, Fishing Ministers, and the Parliament Fishery Committee. I believe because the positions are quite similar, the Fisheries Ministers have followed the lead given by Parliament in its positions, that reaching that agreement between the two institutions will take some weeks, but I do believe you can see clearly where the compromises are going to be made that make sure we have what we all hope for, which is a radical reform of fishing policy that gives fishermen a future, and most important, I think too, from Scotland's perspective, actually gives us some power to implement it in the way that suits the Scottish fishing industry.